It started like any other evening, a business event my wife Chloe insisted we attend. These events weren't my scene, but I went because I knew they mattered to her. Chloe was the kind of woman who thrived in a room full of people. She radiated confidence, commanding attention with her polished demeanor and sharp wit. I admired that about her, even if I preferred quieter spaces. The venue buzzed with life, conversations weaving through the air like a symphony of ambition. The clink of glasses and bursts of laughter punctuated the night, and Chloe, as always, was at the center of it all. She looked radiant, her smile effortless and magnetic, as if the universe had conspired to place her in this moment. Watching her from a distance, I couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and unease. I'd always been her shadow at these events, her quiet supporter in a sea of noise. I stood near the bar, nursing a drink, feeling like an outsider peering into her world. I wasn't uncomfortable, just detached. These were her people, sharp, driven, endlessly ambitious. My world was smaller, quieter, rooted in the satisfaction of creating something with my own hands, one slow step at a time. But in this space, my pace felt like a fault, a flaw to be hidden away. At one point, I heard her laugh rise above the hum of voices. It wasn't her usual laugh, the warm, genuine one I fell in love with. This was sharper, louder, designed to perform. It drew attention, even mine. As I turned to look, I saw her with her colleagues, a glass in hand, her eyes glinting with a mischievous light. They were tossing playful barbs about relationships, the kind that danced on the edge of cruelty, but stayed just safe enough to be funny. Then it happened. Her words cut through the room like an unexpected gust of wind. A joke at my expense. The group erupted into laughter, but I stood frozen. The words were sharp, not the light teasing I was used to. They stung because they revealed a truth I'd hoped wasn't there. She didn't see me as her equal, not anymore. I smiled, though. That's what you do in these moments, right? Smile, laugh along, and pretend it doesn't matter. But inside, something shifted. It wasn't anger. No, I wasn't angry. It was more like a quiet resignation, a realization that the gap between us had grown wider than I'd allowed myself to see. As the night went on, I lingered on the fringes, observing. Chloe moved seamlessly through the crowd, each laugh, each gesture, a reminder of how different we'd become. I wasn't bitter, just tired. I thought about the years we'd shared, the promises we made, and the person I used to be when I was with her. And in that moment, standing in a room full of strangers who seemed closer to my wife than I was, I asked myself a question I'd never dared to before. What am I still doing here? The answer didn't come right away, but I knew it was waiting, just as the night would eventually end. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if we were destined to meet that rainy afternoon, or if it was just another random moment in a chaotic universe. I remember it vividly, the hiss of tires on wet pavement, the cold drizzle soaking the world in muted gray, and the hum of a busy cafe offering shelter from the storm. I wasn't even supposed to be there that day, just a quick stop for a coffee before heading to the hardware store. Funny how life works. She was there, rushing through the door, juggling an umbrella, a tote bag, and a phone call all at once. Chloe. I didn't know her name yet, but I knew I couldn't look away. She was a force of nature even then. Chaotic, but somehow graceful, commanding the space without realizing it. I was standing near the counter when it happened. She fumbled, her coffee slipping from her hand, and in an instant, the universe offered me an opening. "Here," I said, handing her a stack of napkins before she could even reach for one. She looked up at me, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but her eyes sparkled with something I couldn't quite place. "Thanks," she muttered, trying to clean up the mess. Most people would have laughed it off or ignored her altogether, but I couldn't help myself. I stayed, offering to help clean up, and before I knew it, we were talking. It wasn't a grand conversation, just the kind of small talk you make with a stranger while the barista remakes their coffee. But there was something in the way she spoke, the way her smile lingered at the corners of her lips, that made me feel lighter. I didn't have to work to impress her. She didn't seem like the type to be easily impressed anyway. By the time she walked out of the cafe, I knew I had to see her again. Our first date was just as unassuming as that rainy afternoon. A walk in the park, nothing fancy. We talked about everything: our favorite books, childhood dreams, the small, unpolished details of our lives. She wasn't like anyone I'd met before. Chloe was magnetic, ambitious, and sharp, but there was a softness to her back then, a curiosity that made you feel like you were the most important person in the world when she listened. I remember thinking how different we were, even from the start. I was steady, content with life's quieter pleasures, while Chloe seemed to burn brighter, always searching for something more. I loved that about her. She made me feel like maybe I could burn a little brighter too. The moment I knew I loved her came on another rainy day. We had planned to go out, but the weather had other ideas. Instead, we stayed in, curled up on the couch with takeout and an old movie neither of us had seen before. She wasn't wearing makeup, her hair was a little messy, and she looked real. I remember watching her laugh at some silly scene in the movie, her face lighting up like the sun breaking through a storm, and thinking, this is it. This is what love feels like. I proposed a year later. Nothing elaborate, just the two of us in that same park where we had our first date. I remember fumbling with my words, trying to explain how much she meant to me. She said yes before I could even finish, laughing as she threw her arms around my neck. For a while, it felt like we were unstoppable. Chloe was my balance, my adventure. She pulled me out of my comfort zone, made me see the world in brighter colors. And I thought I gave her something too. A place to rest, to feel safe when the world got too loud. We weren't perfect, but we were happy. At least, that's what I believed. But love isn't static. It grows, it changes, and sometimes it fades in ways you don't notice until it's too late. Back then, though, I wasn't thinking about any of that. I was just a man in love, grateful for the woman who saw something in me worth holding on to. They say you don't notice the cracks in something until they start to spread. At first, they're invisible, just faint stress lines hidden beneath the surface. That's how it was with Chloe and me. For a while, everything seemed fine. We were building a life together, celebrating small victories and navigating the challenges as a team. But somewhere along the line, things began to shift, and I can't pinpoint exactly when it started. I think it was when Chloe's career began to take off. She was always ambitious, one of the things I loved about her. She had a drive that could move mountains, and I was proud of her for it. Watching her climb the corporate ladder was inspiring, but it also brought an intensity into our lives that I wasn't prepared for. Late nights at the office became the norm. Networking events filled her calendar, and our quiet evenings together grew fewer and farther between. Meanwhile, my own path was slower. My small business was steady, not flashy or lucrative, but it gave me purpose. I poured my heart into it, content to build something meaningful at my own pace. But as Chloe's world expanded, mine seemed to shrink in comparison. I didn't mind, at least not at first. I thought we were just different, that we complemented each other like two halves of a whole. The first real crack appeared during one of those networking events she dragged me to. I remember standing off to the side, holding a glass of wine and watching her work the room. She was dazzling, her laughter cutting through the hum of conversation. I couldn't help but feel like an outsider in her world, but I brushed it off. This was her moment, not mine. Then someone asked me about my business. It wasn't unusual. I'd gotten used to these questions at her events. But before I could respond, Chloe jumped in with a lighthearted comment about how I was taking my time with things. It was a harmless joke, or at least that's how it was meant to come across. Everyone laughed, including me, but the smile didn't quite reach my eyes. It wasn't what she said. It was the way she said it, like my pace was something to be laughed at, not admired. That wasn't the only time. Over the months, those little jokes turned into a pattern. She'd tease me about my relaxed approach to life, always in front of others, always with that same laugh that felt like a spotlight on my shortcomings. I started to wonder if she was proud of me at all, or if I'd become an embarrassment she tolerated because of our history. At home, things weren't much better. Chloe was always busy, always preoccupied. She'd come home late, exhausted, and I'd have dinner waiting. I didn't mind cooking. I enjoyed it, actually. But I noticed she stopped thanking me. It became an expectation rather than a gesture of love. Conversations grew shorter, more transactional. How was your day? Fine. How was yours? Fine. And that was it. We stopped talking about dreams, about the little things that used to matter. I told myself it was just a phase, that we were adjusting to new rhythms. But deep down, I felt the distance growing. I started to see the way she looked at me. Not with admiration, but with something else. Something harder to define. Disappointment? Frustration? I couldn't be sure, but it gnawed at me. I'd catch glimpses of the Chloe I fell in love with now and then, usually in those rare, quiet moments when we'd sit together on the couch, the world outside forgotten. But those moments became rarer as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. The cracks were spreading, and I didn't know how to stop them. Maybe I should have said something, but I didn't. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, that things would get better. I wanted to believe we were still the same people who promised to face life's challenges together. But the truth was, we were changing, and I wasn't sure if we were still moving in the same direction. Resentment isn't something that explodes out of nowhere. It's more like a slow, insidious leak. It drips day after day, until one day you look around and realize you're standing ankle-deep in something you can't quite drain. That's how it felt with Chloe and me. I didn't wake up one morning resenting her, or feeling resented by her. It crept in quietly, and by the time I noticed, it had already taken root. It started small, as these things usually do. A comment here, a joke there. At first, I didn't think much of it. Chloe's sense of humor had always been sharp, and she teased me sometimes, sure. I could take it. But the tone began to shift. What used to feel like playful banter began to sting. It wasn't just the words. It was the way she said them. The look on her face, like she was testing how far she could push without breaking something. There was the time at a dinner party when someone asked about my business. I started to explain, excited about a new project I'd been working on, but Chloe jumped in before I could finish. "Nathan's got this whole slow and steady approach," she said, laughing. "He's practically a tortoise in a world of hares." The group laughed, and I laughed too, but inside, it felt like I'd just been put on display. I didn't say anything about it afterward. What was the point? It wasn't worth a fight. But it stayed with me, the way those moments always did. They piled up over time, each one adding a little more weight to the burden I was carrying. The comments didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to escalate. She started making jokes about how much time I spent at home, cooking or working on small projects, as she called them. It wasn't just at parties or networking events anymore. It was at home, in private, where there was no audience to impress. I'd be standing at the stove, stirring a pot of soup, and she'd walk in, toss her bag on the counter and say something like, "You must have too much free time if you can make dinner every night." She said it with a smile, like it was supposed to be funny. But it wasn't funny to me. It was dismissive. It made me feel small, like the things I cared about didn't matter to her anymore. And the worst part was, I started to believe it. I began questioning myself, wondering if I was enough for her, or if I'd ever been. I tried to push back a few times, but it never went well. If I pointed out how her words hurt me, she'd roll her eyes or brush it off. "Oh, don't be so sensitive, Nathan. I'm just joking." That was her go-to defense, as if wrapping cruelty in humor made it less painful. Eventually, I stopped bringing it up. It wasn't worth the fight. But the resentment kept building, and I didn't know what to do with it. What made it harder was that I still loved her. Despite everything, I wanted to believe we could get back to the way things were. I tried to focus on the good moments, those fleeting glimpses of the Chloe I fell in love with. But they were becoming harder to find. She was so busy, so consumed by her career and her ambition, that I felt like an afterthought. Like I was just there, filling space in her life without really being a part of it. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out where we went wrong. Was it me? Was I not doing enough? Or was it her, chasing something so relentlessly that she couldn't see what she was leaving behind? Probably a little of both, but knowing that didn't make it any easier. I started to pull back, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know how to bridge the growing gap between us. I thought maybe if I gave her space, she'd come back to me on her own. But instead, the space just grew wider. And with every joke, every dismissive comment, every moment she looked past me instead of at me, the resentment swelled. By the time I realized how deep it had gone, it felt like there was no way to claw my way out. And worst of all, I wasn't sure if she even noticed. Or if she cared. People assume that silence means peace. But let me tell you, silence can be deafening. It fills the gaps where words should be, where connection should exist. It settles into every corner, amplifying the things you try to ignore. That's what my life with Chloe had become. An oppressive, heavy silence that I didn't know how to break. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when we talked about everything. We'd spend hours on the couch, sharing our dreams, laughing about little things, or debating over nothing in particular. Those moments were my anchor, proof that we were building something together. But somewhere along the line, the conversations changed. Or maybe they just stopped. Now most nights ended the same way. Chloe would come home late, exhausted from work, her phone still buzzing with emails and notifications. I'd greet her at the door, offer her dinner, and get little more than a distracted thanks in return. She wasn't rude. She was just absent. Like her body was there, but her mind was still stuck in the chaos of her day. At first, I tried to fill the silence with my own updates. Stories from the workshop, ideas for projects, little victories that felt worth sharing. But her responses were always the same. A quick nod, a distracted, "That's nice," or, worst of all, a glance at her phone in the middle of my sentence. I stopped trying after a while. It hurt too much to see her disinterest, to feel like I was boring her. I started retreating into myself, not because I wanted to, but because it seemed easier. If I didn't share, she couldn't dismiss me. If I didn't try, I couldn't be rejected. I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd notice the growing gap between us and say something. But she didn't. Or if she did, she didn't show it. The worst part was seeing her light up for other people. At her work events, she was magnetic. She'd laugh, engage, and command the room with ease. I watched her become the version of herself I fell in love with, but only when she was with strangers. At home, that Chloe was nowhere to be found. Instead, I got the tired, worn-out version of her, the one who seemed to view me as an afterthought. I couldn't even be angry about it. Not really. She was working hard, chasing her dreams, and I wanted to support her. But it hurt to feel like I was just the backdrop to her life. The quiet, unremarkable figure who held everything steady while she soared. I didn't know how to tell her that, though. I didn't want to seem needy or insecure. So I swallowed the words and let the silence grow. Every once in a while she'd notice. She'd say something like, "Are you okay? You've been quiet lately." And I'd lie. "I'm fine," I'd say, forcing a smile. What else could I do? If I told her the truth, that I felt invisible, unimportant, would it even matter? Or would she brush it off like everything else? The cracks in our marriage weren't just hers or mine. They were both of ours, feeding off each other. Her neglect fueled my withdrawal, and my silence gave her the space to keep pulling away. It was a vicious cycle, and neither of us seemed willing or able to stop it. I kept hoping things would change. Maybe if I waited long enough, she'd remember what we used to have. Maybe she'd look at me the way she used to, with admiration and love instead of disinterest. But deep down, I knew the truth. People don't change unless they want to, and I wasn't sure Chloe even saw a problem. So I stayed silent, carrying the weight of my own disappointment and heartbreak, waiting for a moment that never seemed to come. It wasn't peace, it was survival, and it was slowly breaking me apart. Breaking points don't announce themselves with fanfare. They creep up on you, like the tide rising slowly until you're drowning before you even notice the water. For me, it wasn't some dramatic argument or a specific moment of betrayal. It was an accumulation of little things. 1,000 small cuts that eventually left me bleeding out emotionally. The night it finally happened was unremarkable, at least at first. We were sitting across from each other at the dinner table, the silence between us as thick and heavy as it had been for months. I'd made lasagna, one of Chloe's favorites. It used to be a dish that brought us together, something we'd eat while laughing about our day or planning for the weekend. But now it was just food, a necessity, not an experience. She came home late as usual, her phone in one hand and her laptop bag in the other. I greeted her at the door, hoping for even the smallest spark of warmth, but she barely looked up. "Smells good," she mumbled, brushing past me to set her things down. I didn't take it personally anymore. I'd trained myself not to. We sat down to eat, and for a while, there was nothing but the sound of forks scraping against plates. I tried to think of something to say, anything to break the silence, but every topic that came to mind felt pointless. She wouldn't really listen. She never did anymore. Then she broke the silence. Not with a kind word, not with a question about my day, but with another one of her jabs. "You must have a lot of free time if you can make dinner like this every night," she said, her tone light, almost playful, as if she didn't realize how deep her words cut. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. It wasn't the first time she'd made a comment like that. But tonight, something about it felt different. Maybe it was the weariness in her voice, or maybe it was the weariness in me. I wasn't angry. Anger takes energy, and I didn't have any left. I just felt done. I set my fork down slowly, carefully, like I was handling something fragile. My eyes met hers for the first time in what felt like weeks, and I saw the faint flicker of confusion there. She was expecting me to brush it off, like I always did. But I couldn't. Not anymore. "I can't do this," I said quietly, my voice steady but soft. She blinked, her fork pausing mid-air. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her tone sharper than I expected. "This," I said, gesturing between us. "I can't keep pretending that everything's fine when it's not. It hasn't been for a long time." Her face shifted, the confusion giving way to something else. Defensiveness, maybe, or disbelief. "We're just going through a rough patch," she said quickly. "Every couple does." I shook my head, the words coming easier now. "This isn't a rough patch, Chloe. This is something broken, and I don't think I know how to fix it anymore." For a moment, she looked like she wanted to argue, but I saw the hesitation in her eyes. She wasn't used to me pushing back, and it threw her off balance. "Nathan, don't be ridiculous," she said finally, her voice tinged with irritation. "We just need more time." I sighed, the weight of years pressing down on me. "We've had time," I said, my voice quieter now. "And all it's done is show me how far apart we've grown." Her eyes darted away, and for a moment, I thought I saw something crack in her, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "So what, you're giving up?" she asked, her voice rising. "No," I said firmly. "I've been holding on, Chloe. For years, I've been holding on, hoping things would get better. But every time I try, you push me further away. I can't do it anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. I stood, my movements deliberate, and pushed my chair back. "I'll stay at my brother's for a while," I said, avoiding her eyes. "We both need some space." I grabbed my keys and walked to the door. As I closed it behind me, I felt an overwhelming wave of sadness, but also a strange sense of relief. It wasn't anger or bitterness. It was exhaustion, pure and simple. I couldn't keep drowning in the silence anymore. Something had to change, even if it meant walking away. I always thought regret was something that hit you like a freight train, a sudden crushing force that knocked the wind out of you. But it's not like that. Regret is quieter, slower. It sneaks up on you, wraps around you like a fog, and by the time you realize it's there, you're already lost in it. That's what it felt like after I walked out that night. Sitting in my brother's spare room, staring at the ceiling, I had nothing but time to think. And when you're alone with your thoughts, they don't just stay quiet. They poke and prod, digging up memories you'd rather leave buried. I started replaying everything. The moments that led us to this point, the things I said, the things I didn't say. Every memory felt sharper in the silence. I thought about the early days with Chloe, back when we couldn't stop talking to each other. How her laugh used to light up a room, and how just hearing it would make my day better. I thought about the little traditions we used to have. Sunday morning pancakes, late night walks when the world was quiet, the way we'd sit on the couch and talk for hours about nothing and everything. Those moments felt like a lifetime ago, like they belonged to someone else. But the hardest memories weren't the good ones. They were the ones where I saw the cracks starting to form and did nothing about it. I thought about all the times I let her words slide, convincing myself it wasn't worth a fight. The times I noticed her pulling away but didn't know how to bring her back. I told myself I was being patient, giving her space. But now, looking back, I wondered if I'd just been avoiding the truth. That we were drifting apart, and I didn't know how to stop it. I'd been so focused on keeping the peace that I didn't realize how much I was losing in the process. I let her jokes, her dismissive comments, chip away at me because I thought that's what love was. Enduring, forgiving, staying steady no matter what. But love isn't just about endurance. It's about connection, about showing up for each other even when it's hard. And somewhere along the line, we both stopped showing up. I'd be lying if I said I didn't blame her at first. It was easier to put the responsibility on her, to tell myself she was the one who changed, who pulled away. But the truth is, I wasn't blameless. I let the silence grow between us. I let my own hurt turn into resentment. Instead of fighting for us, I retreated, hoping she'd notice and fix it for me. But relationships don't work that way. They're not one-sided. I wondered if she was sitting at home thinking about me, about us, or if she was too busy with work to notice I was gone. The thought stung more than I wanted to admit. For years, I'd convinced myself that Chloe didn't need me as much as I needed her. And maybe that's what hurt the most. That the woman I loved seemed so self-sufficient, so untouchable, that I didn't know how to reach her anymore. As the days passed, regret settled deeper into my chest. I regretted not speaking up sooner, not telling her how her words made me feel. I regretted not trying harder to pull her back when I saw her slipping away. And most of all, I regretted letting us get to this point. Two people who once loved each other now standing on opposite sides of a widening chasm. But regret alone doesn't fix anything. I knew that. Sitting in that room, I asked myself the same question over and over. Do I still want to fight for this? For her? For us? And the answer was always the same. Yes. But the bigger question was, does she? Because if she didn't, no amount of regret or effort on my part could bridge the distance between us. I didn't know if I had the strength to face her again, to lay everything out and risk being rejected. But I also knew I couldn't stay in this limbo forever. Regret is a powerful thing, but it's not enough to build a future on. and if I wanted any chance at saving what we had, I'd have to take the first step, even if it terrified me. When I finally decided to go back, I wasn't sure what I was walking into. Part of me expected the house to feel cold and lifeless, like a place I no longer belonged. Another part of me hoped Chloe would be waiting, sitting on the couch, ready to talk. Neither of those things happened. The house looked exactly as it always did, immaculate, organized, a reflection of her. But it felt hollow. Or maybe it was me who felt that way. I sat in the car for a good 10 minutes before going inside. The truth is, I was scared, not of her anger or her disappointment, but of the possibility that she wouldn't care. That was my worst fear, that my absence had been nothing more than an inconvenience, something she'd barely noticed amidst her whirlwind of work and ambition. When I finally walked through the door, she looked up from her laptop, startled. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Her face was hard to read. There was surprise, yes, but also something else. Was it relief? Sadness? Guilt? I couldn't tell. "You're back," she said, closing her laptop. Her voice was neutral, almost guarded, and it cut me more than any angry words could have. "Yeah," I replied, my own voice barely above a whisper. I set my bag down by the door and took a deep breath. "We need to talk." She nodded slowly, gesturing for me to sit. As I took a seat across from her, I realized just how far apart we drifted. It wasn't just physical distance. It was emotional, spiritual, every kind of distance you can imagine. But I was here to try. I owed us that much. "I've been thinking," I started, my words careful, deliberate. "About us, about what went wrong." She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring absently. "So have I," she said quietly. The tension between us was suffocating, but I pushed forward. "I know I haven't been perfect, Chloe. I know I've let things slide, avoided conversations I should have had. But I can't keep pretending everything is okay when it's not." Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, and for the first time in years, I saw vulnerability there. "I don't know what to say, Nathan," she admitted. "I don't even know where to start." "Start anywhere," I said, my voice soft but firm. "I just need to know if you still want this, if you still want us." She hesitated, and in that pause, my heart felt like it might stop. But then she spoke, her voice trembling. I do want us, Nathan, but I don't know how to fix this." Her honesty caught me off guard. Chloe wasn't one to admit weakness, to show cracks in her armor. It reminded me of the woman I fell in love with, the one who used to let me see the parts of her she hid from the rest of the world. "We can't fix this overnight," I said, leaning forward. "But we can start, if we're both willing to try." She nodded, a single tear sliding down her cheek. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "For all the things I said, for the way I made you feel." Hearing those words felt like a small crack of light in the darkness. It wasn't a solution, but it was a beginning. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other.